Well, hello. Welcome back to That Real Estate Show. Happy New Year, everybody. I am so glad that you could join us. My name is Tim, and I'll be your host as we dive into all things real estate. The goal of this show is to be educational and insightful, and hopefully we have a little fun along the way. So That Real Estate Show contains no MSG, and side effects may include happiness, finding your new home, and an easy stress-free transaction. So with that, let's get right into today's episode. We're going to go over a little bit more of the buyer representation agreement. So we talked about that in the last episode. We went through the first 4 sections of that. And so we'll go through a little bit more of it to kind of give you a little bit more detail. I think the first 4 sections are what kind of freak people out the most, because they're just not really sure what they're signing and what does it mean. But the next couple of sections, so sections 5 and 6 that we will talk about today, really they outline what my responsibilities are to you as your agent and what your responsibilities are to me as the client. So, and I think this will really help kind of put it all into perspective and why it's so important that we have one of these buyer representation agreements in place before we, go see houses. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about seller concession. So that's going to be our definition for the week. We're going to look at seller concessions and what that means, what that looks like, in some scenarios where, you might have a seller concession in an offer. And then we're going to look at some market data. We're going to look at Manchester and we're going to look at Cheshire. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right in. All right. So I just wanted to touch on this. I know I kind of beat this like a dead horse, but we want to talk about our mortgage rates high. I hear this from people all the time, and I really just think that that's an excuse that they use to not make the leap, not get into the market, because they're just afraid. They're afraid of paying too much. They're afraid of having to overpay for the house in order to get the house that they want, and then they're afraid that their payments are going to be too high because they think mortgage rates are high. So I actually found this little illustration here. I believe I found it on Facebook, and I thought this was really a good way to put it. It said, if you look at it really close, it says in October of 1981. That's the caption at the top. It says mortgage rates hit 18% and buyers are still buying. Now I looked it up, and that's actually true. So in October of 1981, a 30-year, the average on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage was 18 point something percent. And you see on the little sticky note that's on there, it says a 7% rate is not historically high. It's historically normal. 3%, however, was historically low. So, it seems like everyone's like, wait, I want that 3%. I want that 3%. And it's just not going to happen. I really hate to burst your bubble. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but honestly, it's just not going to happen. The only way you're ever going to see another 3% or 2% rate like we did during COVID is if we have another catastrophe like that. If we have another global pandemic like COVID, or even like if we have another Great Depression. I believe in the 1920s, during the Great Depression, mortgage rates were really that low. But we're just not going to see it. So if that's what you're waiting for, then unfortunately, you're just going to be waiting a really long time, because rates probably are never going to hit that low again. And like I said, historically, 7% is actually normal. So, our mortgage rate's high? The short answer is no. And now you can see right there on the screen, I put, the average rate on a 30-year fixed mortgage between 1975 and 2025. So in those 50 years, the average fixed mortgage, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate was 7.7%. So today, I looked it up today. So today's 30-year fixed rate mortgage interest rate is 6.2. So we're actually below that historical standard. So just if that's what you're waiting for, I just want to encourage you to take that leap, make that first step, contact your mortgage lender, contact your real estate agent, preferably me, right? Hopefully me. Find out what your buying power really is. And don't really worry about that rate, because I know interest rates, they always go up and down, right? With the economy, as things get better or worse, we see rates go up or down. So you could always refinance. I say this all the time. There's a saying in the industry, marry the house, date the rate. Contact your mortgage lender, see how much you can get pre-approved for, see if it's within your budget. Contact, your trusted local realtor like myself. Schedule a showing or attend an open house if they have one. I wouldn't want you to miss out on that opportunity just because you were waiting for rates to come down. I really think it bears repeating because, again, I think that's what's holding a lot of people back because they're waiting for rates to come down. They want that 3%. And it's just not realistic, and it's just not going to happen, not probably within our lifetime. So I wanted to go on the exclusive agency right to represent buyer agreement. That's just a fancy word, fancy way of saying a buyer representation agreement. And like I said, we went over those first 4 sections. So in section 1, it has your name, it has the broker's name. And you may wonder why that is. Why doesn't it have my name? So that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that question. So the reason why my name is not there and the broker's name is there, because your agreement, right, for representation is actually with the broker, not with me specifically. I'm just an agent of that brokerage. So I'm not an hourly employee. I get paid on commission, but I work for them. So your agreement is not with me specifically, it's with them. And why is that important? Again, I'm glad you asked. So the reason why that's important is because what would happen if I died? So say we're in the middle of a transaction, we find the house that you love, you put in your offer, it gets accepted, hallelujah, we're well on our way, we're getting ready for closing, and I drop dead. What happens? What happens then? So if my name were there, then yeah, that would be a problem. But the reason why the broker's name is there because you actually have that relationship with that agency, with that broker. So that would just means that another agent in that office can step into my shoes and complete the transaction. And so you're not out, buying the house. So that's why it actually has the broker's name there and not your agent's name specifically, because your agreement, again, is with that brokerage and not specifically with that agent. So that was sections 1 and 2. Section 3, we just talked about that. It says that you're certifying that you're not already under a buyer representation agreement with anybody else, and you promise that you're not going to sign another agreement with anybody else unless this agreement becomes null and void or you terminate that agreement. And then again, section 4 was just about how your agent gets paid, right? How the commission breaks down. And there's a couple of different ways that can happen. Either the seller's going to offer buyer compensation. So the seller's going to say, all right, I will pay let's say 3% to your agent for bringing you to the table, for completing the transaction. Or they may say, okay, well, I'll pay 1.5%, and then that's between you and your agent to make up the difference. So again, if we negotiated a 3% commission, but the seller's only offering 1.5%, then you would have to come up with that other 1.5% either in cash at closing, or we could write that in as a seller concession. So that's something we will talk about a little bit later. Or the other way is that, if the seller is just saying, well, I'm not going to offer any seller concessions and I'm not paying your buyer commission fee, you have to pay that on your own. So then you would have to come up with that money at closing one way or another. So those are like the 3 major ways that your agent gets paid. So then section 5 talks about the broker or my responsibilities to you. So I wanted to go through this because these are super important. These are the things that your agent is going to do for you and agrees to do for you. So number 1 is to not disclose information that you provide concerning your assets or liabilities or income and expenses, or even your motivation to buy, or even previous offers made, and to only disclose when buyer gives permission or when it's mandated by law. So what that means is that, when the seller says, well, why do they want to buy this house? Or, what's their financial situation, trying to see if you can offer more. I'm legally bound to not disclose that information unless you tell me that it's okay. Number 2, to provide buyers with the benefit of our advice and experience. That is so huge because that's what your agent is there for, to walk you through the process, hold your hand if you need to, and help you to navigate. It's a complex transaction. Don't let people fool you. Buying and selling real estate is not simple. If it was simple, everyone would do it and you wouldn't need a license and we could all just go and do it ourselves. But it is complicated, and sometimes it gets really complicated. So that's one of the things that your agent, as our representative of the broker, is guaranteeing to do, is to provide you with our advice and experience. Number 3, to make a diligent effort to find the properties described above, regardless of the amount of compensation the buyer broker may receive from the seller. So like I said before, if the seller says, well, I'm not offering any buyer compensation, so that's up to you guys to figure that out, I still have to make a diligent effort to find you the property that you want, number of bedrooms, square footage, and in the location, with the terms that that are agreeable to you. I still have to do that regardless of how much compensation I am going to get. So even if we negotiated, say 1%, I'm just going to use that as an example, then the level of service that you should be receiving from your agent should be the same if you're getting 1% or 3% or 5% or 10%. It doesn't matter. So that's what that means here, to make a diligent effort to find the property regardless of the amount of compensation. So next would be to negotiate on buyer's behalf for the terms and conditions agreeable to the buyer. So like we said before, so maybe there's a time crunch, right? So maybe you have to be moved in to your new house by a certain date because maybe you're renting and your lease is up and you have to be out, by the 1st of that next month. So, time would be of the essence. So that would be something we would negotiate with the sellers. Hey, look, we need to take possession, no later than, XYZ date. To assist buyer and represent buyer's interest throughout the transaction. And this kind of goes understated, I think, but as your agent, my first responsibility is to you. It's not to me. It doesn't matter how much money I make. It doesn't matter how much work I have to put into the transaction. I work for you. So my responsibility is to work for your interests throughout the whole transaction, not just at the beginning when you're showing houses, not just in the middle when you're making offers and negotiating, but throughout the entire transaction, right up until the day that you close. That is our responsibility. And to be a fiduciary to the buyer, unless certain fiduciary responsibilities are otherwise limited in a written dual agency consent agreement. So this brings up a good point. This is something that we can dive into a little bit deeper in a different episode. But dual agency is when your agent also represents the other party. So if you're a seller and that your agent happens to bring the buyer to the table, they could possibly become a dual agent by representing that seller. And then vice versa. If you're a buyer and you're saying, hey, I want to go see this house, that agent may also happen to be the seller's agent. So that would then again put them in that dual agency role. So when that happens, your fiduciary responsibility kind of becomes severely limited, right? Because then too much about both parties. So I know if you're the buyer, I know your financial situation. If you're the seller, I know your financial situation. So I can't then disclose that to the other party because that would be unfair, right? So most agents that I know very rarely, if ever, would do a dual agency and represent both sides because it just really becomes kind of complicated and doesn't really let you give that level of service to your client that you would normally give. So that would be the buyer or the broker's responsibility to you as the buyer. So next, we're going to talk about the buyer responsibilities. So there's actually a lot to this. So this actually turns into 2 different slides. So the first one there, to cooperate with broker and be reasonably available to examine real property. That just means that, if a house comes available on the market that fits your criteria, and I call you up and say, hey, I found this great house, 123 Main Street. I think you'd love it. I can get you in today. It just means, you would be reasonably available. So if that day is not good for you, maybe the next day or soon thereafter, but not something where you just drag your feet and say, well, I can't see it for another week. Because honestly, especially in today's market with how hot, everything is and how quickly things sell, it's not going to be there by the time you're actually ready to go look at it. So to be reasonably available. Second, upon request, buyer will give broker financial and personal information regarding the buyer's purchasing ability and needs. So what that means is that, so if I ask you for your pre-approval letter, you're going to share that with me. You're not going to withhold that information. You're not going to withhold information like how many bedrooms that you need or square footage that you might need. Because in order for me to do my job, right, you have to be able to share that information with me. So it's kind of silly that they put that in there, but because why would you work against yourself, right? If you're trying to find a house, if you want to buy a house, why would you work against your agent by not telling them, how much you can afford and what your needs are? Now, with that, I have seen people who are not 100% honest with me. They don't actually come up with the full truth, and then comes out later, once we start seeing some houses, that really their financial situation is a little different than what they first reported. So that just hurts you, because that's just wasting time. If you're seeing houses that really are outside your budget or really just don't fit your needs, you're just wasting your time and your agent's time. So it really kind of behooves you to be open and honest upfront and give the information to your agent that they need to be able to provide you with this, like I said, that most excellent service that they're used to providing. So buyer understands that broker is providing real estate services, and any names of attorneys, contractors, home inspectors, and any other professionals have been furnished as a convenience to the buyer and are not an endorsement or a guarantee of those professionals or their work product. Buyer is not required to utilize the services of any of these companies or individuals. So what that means is kind of pretty self-explanatory, but so as an agent, part of my job would be to refer you to a closing attorney, to a home inspector, or maybe a radon mitigation company. If let's radon is discovered in the property, I can give you recommendations of people to use, but you are not obligated to use those referrals, but they are just there for your convenience. And I, on the other hand, am then not responsible if, say, you hire a home inspector and he ends up being awful and treats you terribly and overcharges you or something like that. That doesn't come back on me. So that's what that means. To order any tests, inspections, and investigations related to the property purchase as buyers deem or to determine the sustainability of the property, or for a buyer's purchase, and identify or verify facts important to buyers' buying decision. So what that means is, again, you can't come back at me and say, well, you sold me a house that is under high tension power lines. Well, that would be obvious, if that were the case, but that would be up to you to do tests, inspections. So if you are concerned that maybe the house was built on an old burial ground or something like that, that's something that's the buyer's due diligence. You would be up to you to research that, to make sure if that's something that's a concern for you, that would be up to you to do that. And again, with the tests like the radon, or say wood destroying insects, also known as a pest inspection. Again, we recommend that, and we can recommend people to do that for you, but it's actually on you to do that, to give you that information to help you make your buying decision. And then these three, are, again, these are super important as well. Buyer acknowledges that a buyer may be recorded on audio and or video surveillance, or otherwise transmitted and or recorded by means of electronic devices anywhere in, around, at, or on the property, inside or outside. Buyer consents to any such audio and or video surveillance, recording, or transmission. And you actually have to initial. That's why I put this little space here with the word initials, because on that buyer representation agreement, you have to initial that spot. And what that means is, because it's 2026 now, Ring cameras and all that kind of stuff, that's what it's talking about. If someone has, a Ring camera outside their house, maybe a motion censored one on their garage because they're protecting their property, it's just letting you know that there's a possibility that when you go see a house with your agent, that you could be recorded either on audio and possibly on video, and that would be because it's transmitted to that homeowner's cell phone or wherever they have that data going. So it's just letting you know that that's a possibility. So it sounds really scary at first, but that's all it's talking about, is if they have some sort of home surveillance, even if they just have cameras or whatever, that there's that possibility. So with that, you kind of want to put that in the back of your mind, because if you really don't like the house or something, you kind of want to keep those comments to yourself. Wait till you're away from the house. If you go to the next house, or if you meet your agent back at the office, if you decide you want to make an offer on a house that you've seen, and you follow them back to their office, that would be the place where you want to discuss like the pros and cons. Or even when you're in the car with your spouse or whoever, that would be the place where you would weigh those pros and cons. Try not to do it out loud in the house or outside of the house, only because what happens then if you said something about the homeowner's taste in drapes or the carpet or the wallpaper or something, and then you ended up making an offer and they heard you say that, they actually, that they might get offended, and then they may like, well, I'm not going to accept an offer from this guy because he doesn't like my taste in decor. So I know that's petty and that's kind of stupid, but believe me, I'm sure it's happened at least once. So, having those thoughts are good and fine. Just be aware that when you're talking outside the house or inside the house, that there may be recording in devices there. So the buyer authorizes broker to disclose buyer's identity to third parties related to the transaction. That's just a fancy way of saying, if I refer you to a closing attorney, I'm going to have to give that closing attorney not only your name and phone number and email address, but a copy of the purchase contract and things like that. Or if I'm referring you to a mortgage lender, they're going to need that information as well. So that just says that you give me permission to do that. And then lastly, questions or requests for information concerning the legal title to property, the residence of convicted persons, tax considerations, wood destroying pests, environmental conditions, properties where shooting sports are conducted, property and building inspections, engineering, or the use or planned uses of neighboring properties should be referred to the buyer's attorney, tax advisor, building inspector, or appropriate governmental agency. What that means is that your agent, if I'm your agent, when we're seeing houses, I'm going to stay in my lane. I am not an attorney, so I'm not going to give you legal advice. I am not a tax advisor, so I can't give you tax advice. I'm not, I don't work for, planning and zoning for that town, so I can't tell you what they may be planning on doing with that empty lot that's behind there. Why is that important? So let's just say you buy a house, and then 2 years later, someone buys the lot next to you and decides to build a Walmart. Well, maybe you don't want to live next to Walmart. Well, you can't then come after your agent and say, well, you didn't tell me that they were going to build a Walmart next to me. Well, that's not anything that, first of all, that I would know. And that is something that you would have had to go to the town and say, hey, are there any, plans in the works for this empty lot that's next to me? So that's basically what it's saying, because again, as your agent, I'm going to stay in my lane. I'm not going to give you advice outside of my expertise. So that's why we have closing attorneys here in Connecticut. That's why you have a tax advisor, someone who can advise you on what your tax implication is going to be for the next coming year, by buying a house, and, building inspectors and government agencies and things like that. So that's where we are with that whole bit. And there is a little bit more. If you are interested in jumping in and getting involved and starting to look for houses, and you want to see a copy of this before you commit to, seeing houses with me or another agent, let me know. I can send you a copy. I can send you a blank copy. You can read it. You can read the last couple of sections that are there. It just talks about some other responsibilities. But we can do that. And, that way you can feel prepared when it comes time to sign that document. So here we are. Our mortgage terminology for the week is seller concession. Certain costs associated with home buying that the seller agrees to pay can include costs related to needing repairs and or closing costs or fees. So like we talked about before, one possible seller concession may be that buyer commission. So if you don't have the money to come up with it on your own, if you don't have, and the seller is only offering, say 1%, but you negotiated with your agent 3%, and you need to come up with the other 2%, you could write that in as a seller concession. Another thing too, like it mentions, is repairs. So say the house needs a new roof, and the seller doesn't want to put a new roof on it before they sell. So you could possibly negotiate that as part of the closing costs, is they would give you back, X number of dollars for replacing the roof. Now, with that, there are limits. With like an FHA loan or a conventional loan, you can only ask for a certain percentage of the total purchase price back as a seller concession. So we can get into that in another episode. All right, so now we're going to take a look at our market report for January. This is 06410, which is Cheshire. You can see that the median list price is $778,572, which is up 15% from November to January. The number of active listings is down to 31. That's down 29% through that same time period. As of yesterday, when I printed this, there was no new listings in the last 5 days, and the median days on market is 93, which is up 5%. So if you are interested in Cheshire, if you want to live there, or if you have a house there and you're wondering how much your house might be worth, I can do a free comparative market analysis for you. We can show you how much your house could potentially sell for and where it falls in relation to that median price. And if you're interested in buying, we can look at those 31 active listings and see if any of them, meet the criteria that you're looking for. So then finally, our market report for Manchester for January 06040. You can see the median list price is $325,000. That's down 7% from November. The median days on market is 59, which is up 43%. So houses are staying on the market a little bit longer. And there are 3 new listings as of yesterday in the last 5 days in Manchester. And the number of active listings is down to 19, down 29%. So again, if that area interests you or you live there and you'd like to see how much your house could potentially sell for and you're interested in selling, give me a call, shoot me a text message. I'll put my information here up on the screen real quick. You can get in contact me, in any of those ways, and I'd be happy to look at that information for you. So that pretty much wraps up our show for this week. I hope you have a great new year. I hope you enjoyed celebrating with your friends and your family through the holidays. And yes, sadly, it's back to work on Monday. So with that, I wish you a happy new year, and I will see you next time.